My name is Edward Collins. I am 70 years old, and until 6 months ago, I believed I had lived a successful life. For 42 years, I loved one woman with everything I had. Her name was Margaret. I met her when we were both young. I was an apprentice electrician with little money, but endless determination. She worked as a receptionist in a small law office. We married before either of us owned anything more valuable than an old second-hand car. We built our lives together from nothing, or at least, that's what I believed. I worked every overtime shift I could find. Eventually, I started my own electrical contracting company. The business grew slowly, then rapidly. By my late 50s, we had contracts across the country, commercial properties, investments, and enough savings that neither of us would ever need to worry about money again. People admired us. They called us the perfect couple. Margaret smiled beautifully in every family photograph. She held my hand during charity events and proudly introduced me as the love of her life. I never imagined those words had become nothing more than a performance. When I turned 68, I stepped back from the company. My management team handled daily operations while I enjoyed retirement. I spent my mornings gardening, volunteering at the local veterans center, and planning holidays with my wife. I thought we were finally enjoying the rewards of decades of hard work. Then small things started changing. Margaret suddenly became protective of her phone. She started dressing far younger than usual. Expensive perfume appeared in the bathroom cabinet. Weekend lunches with friends became overnight trips. Whenever I asked questions, she laughed. "Edward, you're becoming paranoid." I wanted to believe her. After 42 years of marriage, trust becomes automatic. You stop looking for lies because you cannot imagine living beside one. Then one afternoon, everything changed. I returned home early from visiting an old friend. As I walked toward the kitchen, I heard voices coming from Margaret's study. The door wasn't completely closed. "I've almost got everything transferred," she whispered. A man's voice answered. "When does he find out?" "He won't," Margaret said calmly. "He's old. He signs whatever I put in front of him." My heart stopped. I stood frozen. She continued speaking. "Once the final investment accounts are moved, he'll own almost nothing. After that, convincing him to move into assisted living will be easy." The man laughed. "And the house? It'll be ours before Christmas." "Ours. Not hers. Ours." My own wife was discussing my home with another man. I backed away before they could see me. For nearly an hour, I sat inside my car without starting the engine. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was business. Maybe. But deep down, I already knew. That evening, Margaret acted perfectly normal. She kissed my cheek, asked about my day, served my favorite roast dinner. Every smile now looked rehearsed. Every kind word felt poisonous. Over the following weeks, I quietly began paying attention. Bank statements arrived less often. She insisted on handling our finances because she claimed paperwork stressed me. Our financial advisor suddenly stopped calling me directly. Even our lawyer seemed strangely distant whenever I requested meetings. Something was terribly wrong. Instead of confronting her, I did something she never expected. I hired a private investigator. It was the hardest decision of my life. Part of me prayed he would find nothing. Instead, he uncovered everything. Margaret wasn't simply having an affair. She had been involved with the same man for almost 5 years. His name was Daniel Mercer. He was 15 years younger than she was and drowning in debt before meeting my wife. The investigator handed me photographs, holiday resorts, luxury restaurants, hotel entrances. Margaret wore jewelry I had bought her for our anniversaries while holding another man's hand. Then came the financial report. That hurt even more. Using powers I had trusted her with, Margaret had quietly transferred millions from joint investments into companies secretly controlled by Daniel. Every transfer had been carefully disguised, small enough not to attract immediate attention, large enough to empty our future. When I reached the final page, my hands were shaking. Estimated personal loss, £38 million. 42 years of sacrifice. Thousands of 14-hour workdays. Missed birthdays. Sleepless nights. Everything I built, being handed to the man sleeping with my wife. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled, because in that exact moment, I remembered something Margaret had completely forgotten. Years earlier, after surviving emergency heart surgery, I had quietly rewritten one document without telling anyone. Not my business contracts, not my bank accounts, my will. And hidden inside that was one clause capable of destroying every plan she believed was already hers. For the first time since discovering her betrayal, I wasn't thinking like a broken husband. I was thinking like the businessman who had spent 40 years staying 3 moves ahead of every opponent. Margaret believed she had already won. She had no idea the real game hadn't even begun. The morning after reading the investigator's report, I looked at Margaret across the breakfast table and smiled. "So," I said, spreading marmalade across my toast, "how about we spend Christmas in Scotland this year?" She looked up with the same warm smile that had fooled me for decades. "That sounds lovely, Edward. Lovely." The woman who had spent 5 years stealing my fortune could still look me in the eyes without a hint of guilt. I realized then that confronting her would be my biggest mistake. If she knew I had uncovered the truth, she would move the remaining money, destroy evidence, and disappear with Daniel. No, she had spent years building her deception. I could spend a few months building my revenge. That afternoon, I contacted the only person I still trusted completely, my old solicitor, Richard Hayes. He had retired 3 years earlier, but remained one of my closest friends. When I showed him the investigator's evidence, he sat silently for several minutes. Finally, he looked at me. "Edward, this isn't just adultery. It's fraud. I know. We need to move carefully." That was exactly my plan. Richard introduced me to a specialist legal team that quietly began tracing every transfer Margaret had made. The investigators discovered something even worse. She hadn't only transferred money. She had forged my signature on several financial documents. Each forgery gave Daniel's shell companies access to more of my investments. Together, they had hidden millions through complicated transactions designed to make everything appear legitimate. Every forged signature strengthened the criminal case against them. Richard smiled for the first time. "They think they're clever." "Are they?" "No," he replied. "They're greedy. Greedy people always leave fingerprints." Over the next several weeks, I became an actor in my own home. I laughed at Margaret's jokes. I thanked her for cooking dinner. I even pretended to sign routine paperwork without reading it. She grew increasingly confident. One evening, she casually asked, "Have you thought any more about moving into assisted living? It would be easier for both of us." There it was, the next step in her plan. I sighed dramatically. "Maybe you're right. This old house is becoming too much." Her eyes sparkled for only a fraction of a second. She thought I was giving up. Instead, I was giving her exactly what she wanted to hear. A week later, she left for another so-called girls' weekend. The investigator called me within an hour. "It's Daniel again," he said. "They're at the same countryside hotel." I didn't ask for photographs anymore. I had already seen enough. Instead, I asked a different question. "Can you prove where the money ended up?" There was a pause. "Better than that," he replied. "We've identified every account." That single sentence changed everything. With court approval already being prepared, my legal team froze the remaining assets before Margaret could move another penny. She didn't notice. She still believed she controlled everything. Then Richard handed me another surprise. "We've located your original handwritten will." I smiled. Most people believed my fortune would automatically pass to Margaret if I died first. That assumption was exactly what she had relied upon. But years ago, after my heart surgery, I had rewritten my estate. I had never told Margaret, never told my children, never told anyone except Richard. The document contained a clause unlike anything she would expect. If any beneficiary was found to have committed fraud, coercion, forgery, or deliberate financial abuse against me, they would immediately receive nothing from my estate. Not a single pound. Their inheritance would automatically transfer to the Collins Family Foundation, a charity I had quietly established to fund scholarships for disadvantaged students and housing for elderly veterans. Richard looked at me. "She spent years trying to inherit your fortune. And now, if the court confirms what we've uncovered, she'll inherit absolutely nothing." For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. Not because I wanted revenge, because justice was finally within reach. But fate wasn't finished surprising me. 3 nights later, I woke around midnight to get a glass of water. As I walked downstairs, voices drifted in from the study. Margaret had forgotten to close the window. I stayed hidden in the hallway. Daniel was inside my house. "I've spoken to the estate agent," he said quietly. "Once Edward moves out, we'll renovate and sell." Margaret laughed. "He'll never know what happened. And if he changes his mind, he won't. He's lonely. He trusts me completely." Daniel chuckled. "You've played this perfectly." She kissed him. In my home, the home we had built together. I stood there in silence. Not because my heart was breaking. That had happened weeks ago. What I felt now was something colder. Resolve. I quietly returned upstairs, picked up my phone, and sent one message to Richard. "It's time." By sunrise, the legal machinery we had spent months preparing was finally set into motion. Margaret still believed she was only days away from taking everything I owned. She had no idea that, before the week was over, police investigators, forensic accountants, and a judge would begin tearing apart the empire of lies she had spent years creating. And the secret clause in my will was about to become the least of her problems. The next Monday began like every other. Margaret kissed me on the cheek before leaving the house. "I'll be back by lunch," she said with a smile. "Drive safely," I replied. The moment her car disappeared, Richard arrived with 2 forensic accountants and 3 officers from the Financial Crimes Unit. Every document we had collected over the past 2 months was neatly organized in boxes across my dining room table. One officer looked at me carefully. "Mr. Collins, once we begin, there's no turning back." I nodded. I should have done this the day I learned the truth. By noon, investigators had already confirmed dozens of forged signatures. Each transfer Margaret had made created another piece of evidence. Then one accountant uncovered something none of us had expected. Daniel's companies weren't real businesses. They existed only on paper. Millions of pounds had flowed through them before being used to purchase luxury cars, overseas holidays, expensive watches, and a penthouse apartment registered under another company. It wasn't an investment. It was theft. Richard leaned toward me. This case just became much bigger. That afternoon, the court approved emergency freezing orders against every account connected to Margaret and Daniel. Neither of them could move another penny. At exactly 3:15 p.m., Margaret called me. "Edward," she said cheerfully, "one of my cards has stopped working." I pretended to sound confused. "That's strange. I'll call the bank. I'm sure it's just a mistake." "It probably is," I answered calmly. I hung up before she could hear the smile on my face. An hour later, Daniel tried withdrawing money from one of his business accounts. The transaction failed. Then another failed. And another. By evening, every account they controlled had been frozen. Panic had begun. The investigator monitoring Daniel's movements called me. "You were right. What happened?" He stormed into his accountant's office screaming that someone had stolen his money. I quietly thanked him and ended the call. For the first time in years, Daniel knew what it felt like to lose control. Margaret returned home unusually late. She tried acting normal, but I noticed her shaking hands as she poured herself a glass of wine. "The bank systems must be having problems," she muttered. "I'm sure they'll fix it tomorrow," I replied. She studied my face. I smiled gently. She looked away first. The following morning, everything exploded. At precisely 9 o'clock, there was a loud knock at our front door. Margaret opened it. Standing outside were detectives carrying search warrants. "Mrs. Collins," one detective said, "we're conducting an investigation into suspected fraud, forgery, and financial theft." The color drained from her face. "There must be some mistake." "We don't believe there is." They entered the house. One detective approached me politely. "Mr. Collins, thank you for your cooperation." Margaret turned toward me. "Edward," her voice trembled. "You knew." I met her eyes for the first time since discovering the affair. "Yes." The room fell silent. You planned this?" "No," I answered quietly. "You planned this when you decided to steal from your husband." She tried to speak, but no words came out. The detectives searched the study, collected computers, financial records, mobile phones, and external hard drives. Then one officer found a folder hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside were forged documents bearing my signature. Original copies. Margaret closed her eyes. She knew it was over. Before leaving, the lead detective informed her she would be required to attend a formal interview later that week. As the front door closed behind them, Margaret finally broke. She dropped into a chair and began crying. I can explain. I remained standing. Can you explain, Daniel? Her eyes widened. You know about him? I know about the hotels. Silence. I know about the holidays. More silence. I know about the apartments. She lowered her head. I know about every pound you stole. She began sobbing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I almost laughed. No betrayal ever is. That evening, she begged me not to tell our children. They'll hate me. I looked at the woman I had loved for 42 years. I wasn't the one who gave them a reason. 2 days later, the newspapers published the first story. Prominent businessman's wife under investigation in multi-million-pound financial fraud. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors whispered. Charity boards quietly removed Margaret from their committees. Daniel vanished completely. His phone was disconnected. His apartment stood empty. The man she had sacrificed everything for had abandoned her the moment the money disappeared. Richard called that afternoon. We've located him. Where? Trying to leave the country. And he didn't get very far. I looked out at the garden Margaret and I had planted together decades earlier. The flowers were still blooming. The birds were still singing. Life had continued, even while mine had been falling apart. Richard cleared his throat. There's something else. What is it? The prosecution has approved criminal charges. I closed my eyes. The woman who had once promised to love me until death was now facing prison because of her own greed. But the greatest shock was still waiting. During the investigation, detectives discovered one final secret. Something Margaret had hidden from me for more than 20 years. A secret that would completely change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. I thought I had already experienced the worst betrayal imaginable. I was wrong. 3 days after Margaret was formally charged, Richard called and asked me to meet him at his office immediately. His voice was unusually serious. When I arrived, 2 detectives were waiting with a sealed folder. Richard looked at me before speaking. Edward, what you're about to hear has nothing to do with the stolen money. A detective slowly opened the folder. During our investigation, we recovered thousands of emails from Mrs. Collins' laptop. I nodded. We also recovered several deleted conversations dating back more than 20 years. My stomach tightened. The detective slid a photograph across the table. It showed a much younger Margaret standing beside Daniel. My eyes widened. That's impossible, I whispered. They've only been together for 5 years. The detective shook his head. No, sir. He placed another photograph beside the first. Then another. Each one was older than the last. Finally, he looked directly at me. Mrs. Collins has known Daniel for over 22 years. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. 22 years. More than half of my marriage. The affair I believed had lasted 5 years had actually stretched across decades. Every anniversary, every Christmas, every birthday, every family holiday, there had always been another man. Richard handed me a printed email. It was written by Margaret years earlier. Be patient. One day, everything Edward owns will belong to us. The message was dated 18 years before. 18 years. She hadn't made one terrible decision. She had built an entire future around betraying me. The detective continued. We also discovered that Daniel advised Mrs. Collins on every financial transfer. So this wasn't her idea alone? No. They planned everything together. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. I wasn't angry anymore. I simply felt empty. 42 years of memories suddenly looked different. The holidays, the family dinners, the smiles and old photographs. How many of them had been real? When I returned home that evening, Margaret was sitting alone in the living room. She looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. For the first time since I had met her, she looked frightened. She stood as I entered. Edward, please. I remained silent. She began crying. I never meant for it to go this far. I looked at her calmly. When exactly were you planning to stop? She couldn't answer. After stealing 10 million? Silence. 20 million? Nothing. Or after I died believing the woman I loved had always been faithful? She buried her face in her hands. I'm sorry. Those words would have meant everything 42 years earlier. Now they meant nothing. The next morning, our 2 children arrived unexpectedly. Our daughter, Emily, looked confused. Our son, Michael, looked furious. Dad, Emily asked softly, is what we're reading in the newspapers true? Before I could answer, Margaret spoke. Your father is trying to destroy me. I turned toward her slowly. No. I opened a folder and placed copies of the financial evidence on the table. Then I added the photographs. Finally, I placed the printed emails in front of our children. The room fell silent. Emily covered her mouth. Michael stared at the pages without speaking. Then he looked at his mother. You stole from Dad? Margaret nodded weakly. You had another man? Tears rolled down her face. Michael slammed his fist against the table. For 22 years? She couldn't deny it. Emily began crying. I defended you. She pushed the photographs away as if they were burning her hands. I told everyone Dad must have misunderstood. Margaret reached for her. Emily stepped back. Don't. It was the first time either of our children had ever refused their mother's embrace. Margaret collapsed into a chair, sobbing, but the consequences were only beginning. Later that afternoon, the board of my former company held an emergency meeting. Although I had retired years earlier, news of the fraud had damaged the company's reputation. The directors unanimously voted to remove Margaret from every charitable trust, advisory position, and foundation she served. Within hours, sponsors withdrew from the charities she represented. Invitations disappeared. Friends stopped answering her calls. Her carefully built social reputation collapsed almost overnight. That evening, Richard called with another update. Daniel has agreed to cooperate. I frowned. Why? Because the evidence is overwhelming. What does he want? A reduced sentence. I wasn't surprised. Men who betray others for money rarely stay loyal when prison becomes a possibility. Richard continued. He's giving investigators everything. Everything? Emails, bank records, audio recordings. I froze. Audio recordings? Yes. Daniel had secretly recorded many of their private conversations. Conversations in which Margaret openly discussed forging my signature, taking my assets, and waiting for me to die so she could inherit whatever remained. Richard paused before adding one final sentence. Edward, the prosecution believes those recordings will end the case before it even reaches a full trial. I quietly thanked him and ended the call. Outside my study window, rain began falling across the garden. I watched each drop hit the roses Margaret and I had planted together decades earlier. For years, I believed those flowers represented our love. Now they stood as reminders of a marriage built on lies. But one final chapter remained. The courtroom, the secret will, and the moment Margaret would discover that every pound she had spent decades trying to steal had already slipped beyond her reach forever. The courtroom was silent as I walked through its heavy wooden doors. I had spent my life building businesses, negotiating contracts, and solving difficult problems. Yet nothing had prepared me for seeing my wife of 42 years sitting at the defendant's table. Margaret looked nothing like the confident woman who had once hosted charity galas and elegant dinner parties. Her expensive clothes had been replaced by a plain navy suit. The confident smile that had fooled everyone for decades was gone. Daniel sat beside his solicitor, avoiding everyone's eyes. For the first time since I had learned his name, he looked terrified. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The proceedings began with the prosecution presenting months of evidence. Bank records, forged signatures, hidden companies, email conversations. Every document revealed another layer of deception. The prosecutor turned toward the judge. This was not a single dishonest act. It was a carefully planned scheme carried out over many years to deprive Mr. Edward Collins of his fortune. I listened quietly. The facts were painful, but hearing them spoken aloud somehow lifted part of the burden I had carried alone. Then Daniel was called to the witness stand. The courtroom grew even quieter. Under oath, he admitted everything. He confessed that he and Margaret had secretly transferred millions of pounds into shell companies under his control. He admitted helping disguise the transactions and encouraging her to forge my signature. Most shocking of all, He confessed they had discussed placing me in a private care facility once my remaining assets were beyond my reach. I thought we'd never get caught, he said, his voice barely audible. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. You promised me you'd never testify against me, she whispered. Daniel lowered his head. I was trying to save myself. Those words echoed through the courtroom. The two people who had betrayed me had finally betrayed each other. Next came the audio recordings. The prosecution played them through the courtroom speakers. Margaret's voice was unmistakable. Edward trusts me completely. Another recording followed. Once everything is transferred, he'll have nothing left. Then the final recording. After he dies, Daniel and I can finally start our real life together. The courtroom fell silent. Several members of the public shook their heads. One juror wiped away a tear. Margaret covered her face. For the first time in 42 years, there was no lie left to hide behind. When my turn came to testify, I walked slowly to the witness stand. The prosecutor asked only one question. Mr. Collins, what has been the greatest loss in this case? I looked at Margaret. It wasn't the money. The courtroom remained silent. I built my fortune once. I could have built it again. I paused. What I can never rebuild is 42 years of trust. Not a single person spoke. Even Margaret began crying. The judge thanked me, and I returned to my seat. After several hours of legal arguments, the judge announced a short recess before delivering his decision. During that break, Richard leaned toward me. There's one final matter. I knew exactly what he meant. My will. When court resumed, Richard requested permission to address the judge regarding my estate. He explained that years before, I had legally amended my will following major heart surgery. The judge reviewed the certified documents carefully. Richard then read the clause aloud. If any beneficiary is found by a court to have committed fraud, forgery, financial abuse, or deliberate coercion against Edward Collins, that beneficiary shall immediately forfeit every right, claim, or future interest in his estate. The courtroom became perfectly still. Richard continued. All forfeited assets shall instead pass to the Collins Family Foundation. Margaret looked confused. Then the meaning struck her. She suddenly stood. No. Her voice echoed across the courtroom. That money belongs to me. The judge looked at her sternly. It did not belong to you yesterday, Mrs. Collins, and it certainly does not belong to you today. She turned toward me, tears streaming down her face. Edward, please. For the first time since our marriage began, I felt no anger, only acceptance. You stopped being my partner the day you chose greed over love. Margaret sank back into her chair. Everything she had spent more than 2 decades planning had vanished in a single afternoon. But the judge had not yet delivered the final verdict. And when he finally spoke, the punishment would be even greater than either Margaret or Daniel had imagined. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Everyone waited for the judge's decision. Margaret sat motionless, staring at the floor. Daniel looked pale, his hands trembling. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading his ruling. After reviewing the evidence, this court finds both defendants guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, financial abuse, and theft. Margaret closed her eyes. Daniel buried his face in his hands. The judge continued. The fraud committed against Mr. Edward Collins was not a single mistake. It was a deliberate scheme carried out over many years, involving deception, forged documents, hidden companies, and abuse of trust. He paused before delivering the sentence. Mr. Daniel Mercer, you are sentenced to a term of imprisonment. You are also ordered to surrender all assets purchased with stolen funds. Daniel showed no emotion. It was as though he had already accepted his fate. Then the judge turned toward Margaret. Mrs. Margaret Collins, this court finds your betrayal especially serious because your victim was your own husband of 42 years. You abused his trust for personal gain and attempted to deprive him of everything he had built through a lifetime of honest work. Margaret began crying uncontrollably. You are sentenced to imprisonment in accordance with the law. In addition, every asset obtained through fraudulent transfers shall be returned to Mr. Collins or to the appropriate legal authorities. The courtroom remained silent. It was over. 42 years of lies had finally met the truth. As people slowly began leaving, Margaret turned toward me one last time. "Edward," her voice was barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." I looked at the woman I had once imagined growing old beside. "I already forgave you," I said quietly. She looked surprised, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. Tears streamed down her face. "I loved you once." "I know." "So did I," she whispered. Maybe she believed that. Maybe long ago, it had even been true. But somewhere along the way, greed became more important than love. 2 prison officers gently escorted her from the courtroom. She never looked back. A few weeks later, the legal process was finally complete. Every fraudulent transfer was reversed. The shell companies were dissolved. Properties purchased with stolen money were sold under court supervision. Most of my fortune was recovered. The Collins Family Foundation officially became the largest beneficiary of my estate, exactly as my secret will had intended. Instead of becoming someone's stolen inheritance, the money began funding university scholarships, housing for elderly veterans, and medical grants for families who could never have afforded treatment. Watching those first scholarship recipients receive their acceptance letters brought me more happiness than any luxury car or mansion ever had. For the first time in years, my wealth was changing lives instead of destroying them. Emily and Michael stood beside me throughout the process. They apologized repeatedly for believing their mother's excuses. I hugged both of them. "You don't need to apologize," I told them. "You were victims of her lies too. Our family had been broken, but not completely. Slowly, we began rebuilding what honesty could still save." One sunny afternoon, several months later, I returned to the garden behind my house. The roses Margaret and I had planted decades earlier were blooming beautifully. For a long time, I had considered digging them out. Instead, I decided to leave them exactly where they were. Not because they reminded me of her, because they reminded me of a lesson. Even beautiful things can grow from difficult seasons. Life doesn't end when someone betrays you. Sometimes it begins again. On my 71st birthday, Richard visited with a small wooden box. Inside was the original handwritten will I had signed years earlier after my heart surgery. The very document Margaret had forgotten existed. Richard smiled. "You know, this single piece of paper changed everything." I nodded. "No." He looked confused. "It didn't change everything. It revealed who everyone truly was." That evening, I sat alone on my porch as the sun disappeared behind the hills. For the first time in decades, there were no lies inside my home. No secrets. No pretending. Just peace. People often ask whether I regret the 42 years I spent with Margaret. The answer always surprises them. No, because those years gave me my children, taught me resilience, and showed me that character is worth more than any fortune. Money can be stolen. Property can be replaced. Even broken hearts can heal. But integrity is something no thief can ever take. If my story has taught me anything, it is this. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never mistake kindness for foolishness. And never believe that greed can defeat the truth forever. In the end, I didn't win because I had more money. I won because after losing everything I thought mattered, I refused to lose the one thing that mattered most, my honor.